So our first speaker is going to be Paul Monson. Paul is an assistant professor of church history at Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology in Wisconsin. He received both his MA and his PhD from Marquette. He specializes in the history of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, with a particular focus on its transatlantic and intercultural dimensions. His areas of interest also include monasticism, ecclesiology, ecumenism, and Catholics in Hollywood. Paul's work has appeared in the vital subject. Paul's work has appeared in numerous academic publications and has also been awarded a number of research and development grants, including most recently the Bishops and Theologians Reading Group Initiative grant from the Catholic Theological Society of America. And he was a visiting assistant professor of theology here at LMU between 2014 and 2016. His paper is entitled Newmanian Idea or American Corporation, Revisiting the Catholic University Through Ignatian Eyes. After Paul speaks, we will hear from Timothy Burns, who received his PhD in philosophy from University College Dublin in 2015 and is currently a lecturer in philosophy at California State University, Channel Islands. He has also served as visiting assistant professor in philosophy at Loyola Marymount. Tim uses a phenomenological approach and engages traditions of thought and philosophers who are outside of the continental tradition. His research revolves around the ways in which we experience the social world. Currently, he's working on a book that will introduce the phenomenological writings of Edith Stein, showing the relevance of her thought in contemporary debates on social issues. And his paper is entitled, What Kind of Community is a Catholic University? So welcome back, Tim and Paul.
So good afternoon. Thank you for showing up after lunch. This is, of course, the slot everybody wants to have. So I've decided to make it a little entertaining. I've tried to add a lot of humor. I'm going to warn you, however, my wife thinks I have a very awkward sense of humor. So you've been warned. And can you hear me okay in the back?
Yes.
All right. So, as Catherine already said, I had the distinct pleasure of serving LMU as a visiting professor about 2 years ago, theological studies. During this time, I was once walking across campus with a very dear friend and colleague, I should say, not in theological studies. I believe we were on our way to the Loft, LMU's pub, or at least I'd like to think we were on our way. Somehow the topic of Catholic identity emerged in the course of conversation, and I remarked that the placement of LMU's iconic chapel at the center of its campus serves to reinforce this identity. My colleague and friend found this inconsequential, even absurd. The chapel, he opined, was in fact a distraction from LMU's Jesuit identity, an identity steeped in social justice, not God. I believe at this point I made some jocular, albeit snide quip, that it was the Jesuits, after all, who had built the chapel, and that this should be obvious. Now, contrary to fears that may be forming in this room, I share this story not as a means to pontificate on the need for more theology classes in the core, or as a call to institute mandatory chapel attendance. And as the Catholic intellectual tradition itself reminds us, social justice and spiritual excellence are not mutually exclusive. To the contrary, they reinforce each other. Rather, this story is my own confession of a moment in which I succumbed to a distraction that continues to haunt American Catholic institutions of higher education. When considering the idea of a university in this century, the ghosts of the past century continue to heckle in our ears. As if suffering from exorcism, some proclaim a crusade for social justice, while others counter with an altar call to return to Christ. Both distract from a more pressing concern that plagues American higher education in general. Catholics remain aloof to the alarming analysis of Jennifer Walshburn and other scholars who pointedly conclude that American universities have become little more than glorified corporations. Students are now consumers of a professional product with an astronomical price tag, one that marginalizes the poor and exploits the adjunct. American Catholic universities would like to think themselves immune from this reality, asserting rather that they are invested in a distinct idea with occasional lip service to John Henry Newman, whom they often don't read. Their Newman, however, be he conservative or liberal, is in fact a ghost, and their idea of a university a Newmanian nightmare. Questions of identity have clouded a more robust conversation on distinctiveness, and from this mist, the 21st century greets the Catholic University Incorporated. If we can indeed conclude that the American Catholic University has become a corporation in academic regalia, then, to quote Flannery O'Connor, the hell with it. If you want a degree, there are cheaper and more prestigious options. I would prefer to presume, however, that corporatization remains a question rather than a verdict. And if Catholic universities are to avoid the cancer of corporatization among their secular peers, they need an antidote. Inspired by this conference, I proposed the experimental remedy, namely, rereading Newman's idea through the Ignatian lens of the cura personalis, that is, the care of the whole person. I contend that the Jesuit tradition provides a key insight into the distinctiveness of Catholic universities in this century, and this distinctiveness lies in the liberal education of the whole person. The liberal education of the whole person. To support this claim, this paper first revisits Newman's idea of liberal education before re-examining that enigmatic model that adorning many a brochure at a Jesuit university, the Cura Personalis. From this twofold study, I propose a threefold approach to the distinctiveness of Catholic universities today. This approach, gleaned from professional experience, hinges on an interdisciplinary community, faculty mentorship rather than advising, and diversified individuality, all three manifesting an authentic cura personalis within a liberal education. So first, Newman. Before we delve into Newman's idea of liberal education, we first need to check some cultural baggage at the university gate. Who is this John Henry Newman, after all? Some within the 21st century Catholic University, for some, the name may conjure the infamous Cardinal Newman Society and its conservative rankings of Catholic universities. Once, at a reception here at LMU, a VP confessed her very negative image of Newman based on this society, a policeman of Catholicism, with baton in hand, ready to bludgeon all Catholic universities. For others in Catholic academia, Newman's name elicits memories of Ex Corde Ecclesiae and the place of theology in Catholic universities. In his idea of a university, Newman does indeed devote his first few discourses to an adamant argument that the university must include theology among its disciplines if it is to be truly universal in its scope of knowledge, to be a true university. Newman thus becomes an ally for theology departments dogged with declining budgets, even a friend for fellow colleagues in the humanities. But I would like to posit Newman as more than just an ally for theology or religion or the liberal arts. If we refocus his idea to that of liberal education rather than the role of theology, we find a key ally in the struggle against corporatization of modern Catholic universities. In Newman's words, a university is, quote, an alma mater, knowing her children one by one, not a foundry or a mint or a treadmill. Beautiful quotation. This pithy salvo against corporatization stems from one of Newman's most curious distinctions between education and instruction. As Newman sees it, there are two approaches or methods to education. One he terms philosophical, the other he terms mechanical. The former finds its home in the university, a place of true education. The latter, the mechanical model, the student is but a cog, a product of mere instruction. With Newman, we could say a true university educates, a corporate institution merely instructs. However, Newman does not content himself with education per se. but rather insists on what he calls a liberal education. A liberal education scorns a utilitarian approach to knowledge that seeks material, professional, or even spiritual gain. Rather, Newman insists on what he terms philosophical knowledge, knowledge that liberates the mind from pragmatic constraints and worries. Thus, liberal education finds its home in philosophical knowledge, not useful knowledge. A philosopher's trap, some may retort. Newman wants idle philosophy majors. God help us all. Newman is a Victorian aristocrat pining for a lost Athens, aloof to the problems and exigencies of the modern world. Can this liberal knowledge really speak to universities today, in which alumni seek jobs, faculty pay, and administrators donors? Modern universities cannot attain Newman's Oxfordian idea. They cannot depend on the crown to bankroll a life of philosophical leisure. Besides, if knowledge is the goal, how in the world can one study all the diverse subjects that comprise a university, or at least Newman's university, an institution, according to his own definition, home to all avenues of knowledge? If Newman were here, I believe he would calmly ponder these objections, pour himself a spot of tea, and gently tell us we're missing the point. In later discourses in his idea, Newman, in fact, addresses the obvious objection that no student could possibly ever study every academic subject offered in a university, be it Oxford or a local community college. For Newman, rather, liberal education, a university education, is not about the acquisition of knowledge, but rather its analysis. Its end is to gain a sense of the whole, a, quote, connected view or grasp of things, or in a word he crafts with Victorian finesse, a certain viewiness. Viewiness. One can read an entire library, but this is not the knowledge of which Newman speaks. Liberal education is about more than a smorgasbord of knowledge before one's intellectual appetites. It is also about its digestion, a digestion possible only with philosophy applied to the acquisition of facts and data. Liberal education does not produce a student who knows, but thinks while she knows. The liberally educated stands above her knowledge, Newman's word, and does not buckle under it. Liberal education, in Newman's words, provides a clear, calm, accurate vision and comprehension of all things. Its primary goal is the inclusion of analytical skills that can confidently assess the complex mosaic of reality in all its various hues. It avoids graduating what Newman derides as a man of one idea, or what he scorns with a vengeance, a bigot. Liberal education appreciates and grasps the whole in knowledge, not whole of knowledge, the whole in knowledge. That is, how ideas fit together. In charming Victorian prose, Newman explains that this liberal education seeks, and here I quote, to open the mind, to correct it, to refine it, to enable it to know, and to digest, master, rule, and use its knowledge, to give it power over its own faculties, application, flexibility, method, critical exactness, sagacity, resource, address, eloquent expression. Does this description not fit the alumni we seek? Thus, by philosophical knowledge, Newman does not mean a college full of philosophy majors. Sorry. Rather, Newman seeks the philosophical skills of analysis, what we might term analytical knowledge. And the university, by being broad and universal in the scope of subjects, facilitates this objective not in a mere collection of specializations, but rather the conversation between specializations. Consequently, in addition to interdisciplinarity and analytical skills, Newman further maintains that a university must be a community. He goes so far to insist that on the residential nature of a university, a place where conversations extend beyond the classroom to dormitories, refectories, libraries, hallways, courtyards, quads, pubs, even lavatories. Newman would not endorse online modes of education, and not simply because he could not anticipate the glories of 21st century technology and interconnectivity. Could not anticipate Silicon Valley or Silicon Beach. Rather, for Newman, education is about interpersonal interaction within this community. Interaction that includes subtle gestures and intonation between individuals. In a jarring line, Newman laments that there is, quote, nothing individual about the curriculum of new universities in his own day. What he meant is that in adopting a mechanical pedagogy with large lecture halls, education had become, in his words, shallow and superficial, lacking the individual interpersonal interaction that fosters depth, struggle, and analysis. Community, in other words, is not for the sake of concord. On the contrary, community nurtures individual development through a robust conversation, including challenging and controversial discourse. So, moving on to Jesuits. At this point, those among us who speak Jesuit should be intrigued, for our focus on the individual is at the heart of the Cura Personalis and Ignatian pedagogy. Here, Ignatius and the Jesuit tradition have much to offer in nuancing Newman's idea for the 21st century. For Newman's reflections on individual development remain, in fact, underdeveloped in his own idea. However, before turning to the idea of the Cura Personalis, a brief history lesson on the concept. Some in this room may be surprised to learn that the term Cura Personalis finds its genesis no earlier than in the last century. In 1934, to be exact, about when LMU looked like that in back. As Barton Geiger aptly demonstrates, the Jesuit General Superior at the time coined the phrase in his new instructions for American Jesuit universities, many of which were suffering from a lack of identity and purpose after the Great War. Even then, the language did not catch on, and it was not until a 1972 speech by Pedro Rupe, crafted by Lawrence McGinley, ended up being president of Fordham, I believe, that Jesuit higher education began to take note. The 1980s and 90s gradually embraced the term, and at the beginning of this century, the language of Cura Personalis became an indisputable hallmark of Jesuit education, not only in the United States, but also globally. So much so that in 2007, Superior General Father Peter Hans Klovenbach focused on the term in a major address. More important, however, in this address, Klovenbach claimed the term as distinctly Ignatian rather than just Jesuit, directing his listeners to Ignatius of Loyola's annotations at the beginning of the spiritual exercises, with the terms spiritual and conceptual birth. If one indeed turns to these annotations, or as they more commonly called introductory explanations, one immediately encounters language that Newman himself could have penned. Already in the second paragraph, Ignatius posits what, quote, satisfies the soul consists not in knowing much, but in our understanding the realities profoundly and savoring them interiorly. Is this not Newman's point about the skills of analysis in relation to the acquisition of knowledge? Likewise, in the same paragraph, Ignatius simultaneously calls for a, quote, personalized approach when directing the exercises, echoing Newman's approach to liberal education. Ignatius advises the director to tailor the length and pace of the typically 4-week exercises, according to the dispositions of each individual retreatant. In other words, the exercises do not constitute some fail-safe formula for success. Rather, the director must diligently discern how the retreatant individually progresses, attentive to moments of consolation and desolation, making necessary adjustments. The director should vehemently discourage any hasty decisions or promises in the moments of either great joy or deep sadness. Overall, throughout his explanations, Ignatius stresses that the exercises, quote, should be adapted to the disposition of the person according to age, education, and ability. Those are his words. This line articulates the essence of the Cura Personalis, attentive guidance to the individual in her development, requiring patience, wisdom, and foresight, The Cura Personalis is not a program. Rather, it is a dialogue, a journey, an interpersonal relationship. Applying Ignatius's insights to Newman's idea, we could say that while Newman highlights education as viewiness, as gaining a sense of the whole in knowledge, Ignatius nuances this viewiness to include appreciation of the whole person, whole knowledge with whole personhood. But how does this integration of liberal education with the Cura Personalis apply to the stark realities of 21st century Catholic higher education? We do not share the sensibilities of Newman's Victorian Oxford or Dublin, where he delivered the discourses. Nor do we share the 16th century culture of Ignatius in Rome, or even American Jesuits a century ago. Nevertheless, Newman never let his idea stand apart from explicit examples. He gave many examples. And the Ignatian tradition continues to ground itself in the realities of human experience. In the time remaining, and inspired by Newman in conversation with Ignatius, I propose 3 avenues for recovering a sense of distinctiveness in Catholic higher education in the face of corporatization today, with tangible examples for implementation. So get ready. First, the Catholic University must be an interdisciplinary community, the very mission of LMU's Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination. If the Catholic University is little more than a collection of faculty siloed in their specializations, the departments for academics become mere departments for the production of degrees, like a corporation. This claim, of course, is far from revolutionary, yet I highly doubt that our nominal commitment to collegiality and a community of scholars would much impress me. But lamentation does not suffice. We need a remedy. So allow me to dabble in controversial ideas I need not defend in a committee meeting. If we are to be institutions offering a distinct viewiness in accord with Newman's vision of liberal education, Catholic universities today should require all students to double major, with 1 major in the liberal arts and 1 outside of the liberal arts, be it business, communication, engineering, science, or, at LMU, film and television. No exceptions. Such a plan would ensure that each student is challenged by knowledge beyond her immediate interests and foster interdisciplinary integration. By discouraging the isolated business major or the theology and English major, which would have been my preference, the student develops something of Newman's viewiness, realizing the whole of knowledge does not rest in their personal preferences. The student expands her horizons, and she comes to appreciate a sense of the whole in knowledge. Now, I can already sense some murmurs and fidgeting. We already have this. It's called the Common Core. But let's be honest. The core curriculum in most Catholic universities suffers from years of infighting and turf wars, sometimes with guerrilla tactics. Moreover, a Common Core may facilitate breadth, but rarely depth. As Newman insists, liberal education shirks shallowness, and by prompting students to study at least 2 disciplines in depth, they emerge humble yet confident, able to grasp complexities and subtleties, able to analyze rather than merely describe. Students emerge intelligent persons, not mechanical parrots. Before I am shown the door, however, let me offer a second radical idea: faculty mentorship. Again, many Catholic universities pays lip service to mentorship, just like interdisciplinary. But do we mentor or simply advise? If we are honest, do students seek their advisors for advice or for required rubber stamps so that they can finally enroll for courses before they have to be on a waiting list? And do we as faculty treasure such advising sessions, or do we dread them as distractions? Again, let us not do more than just dabble in abstraction. Faculty, like students, need practical incentives. If we value student assessment of faculty teaching, why not student assessment of faculty advising? Why do we set high expectations for performance in the classroom and not in one-on-one sessions with students? Moreover, why is experience in student mentorship not a fundamental part of faculty hiring? Here I get very radical. While letters of support from colleagues are essential, for sure, why not also require a letter from a mentored student? Someone who can attest to the candidate's desire to nurture individual students, and not just numbers. And if we move beyond the stigmas associated with student advising and inculcate a culture of student mentorship, Ignatius's career personalities comes to life and ensures that Jesuit distinctiveness, or marketing, or branding, if you will, does not disappoint. Both students and parents demand that faculty fundamentally care about not only learning, but also the individual student, him or herself. And if a Catholic university, a Jesuit university, can articulate concrete ways in which it ensures faculty commitment to mentorship, prospective families leave campus intrigued and, most important, with a sense of trust. Now, at this point, I fear a projectile may be heading my way. So let me limit myself to a third and final suggestion, namely diversified individuality. I realize that this may sound like academic babble, so let me explain. If Catholic universities are to assume the lens of the cura personalis, of the whole person, then Catholic institutions should also rethink, or better yet, expand their sense of diversity. Diversity not in terms of statistics, but in terms of persons. Despite our noble pursuit of a diversity that reflects the real world, rather than white American suburbia, it can be self-congratulatory, even myopic. Race and economic background do matter, and should. But a Catholic sense of diversity, an Ignatian sense of diversity, goes deeper, aided both by a sense of interdisciplinarity and authentic mentorship. Do we really know our students, not only in their educational background, but also their cultural, familial, personal backgrounds? Are we aware of their trials, their joys, their fears, their hidden talents? Do we see a statistic or a person? A university cannot teach a sense of the whole if it cannot appreciate the whole student. And this requires individualized attention, just as it does in Ignatius's spiritual exercises. As Ignatius articulates at the very opening of his exercises, immediately after his annotations, we are to presume the good in a person and not rush to judgments or tidy conclusions. Now, perhaps I'm alone, but I think we as faculty do this all the time, rush to judgments, even unconsciously. For instance, when we encounter two Latinas in our classroom, do we presume that they share the same cultural, linguistic, and religious background? Only individualized attention reveals that one may practice her faith, and the other not know the first thing about Catholicism. One may come from an affluent background, the other may be a first-generation college student. Again, if we do not move beyond a sense of diversity for accreditations, or beyond approach the student as a client merely to appease, if we do not gain a sense of the whole person, we cannot care for this person. Our cura personalis becomes hollow, or in Newman's words, shallow. So what is the remedy? I propose a simple, albeit audacious solution. All faculty should require all of their students in any given semester to meet with them at least once in their office for a one-on-one conversation, not only about coursework, but also about larger concerns, their aspirations for the class, their unspoken hurdles. This is not about prying. It's about attentiveness and receptivity to the experience of the student. Of course, many may balk at this idea, and many faculty feel smothered with other duties, as do I. However, I know it is possible, as I have done it here at this very institution, and did so with a 4-4 load and about 100 students. Now, yes, this may be why I began to gray. But my teaching significantly improved because I knew more about each individual student, more than a fatigued face of apathy at 8 a.m. in the morning. Granted, such an idea involves larger conversations about teaching loads and service work. but I dare say it is essential for the distinctiveness of Catholic universities today, and especially Jesuit universities committed to an authentic cura personalis. Such a step is also essential for a truly liberal education, to ensure with Newman that the university is not a mint, that we as faculty are not stamping students with our own image, or presuming their worth based on demographics and grades. If we are to be distinct and not corporate, we must know each student one by one. We must be a student's alma mater. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, and let's welcome Timothy Burns.
I'd like to thank Paul for a wonderful talk, and now for something completely different. An essay. No. Thank you to Kat and Emmy Lou and Brian for organizing the conference. In an effort to get through everything that I have to say, I'm going to start on page 3. If you want to talk about the introduction, we can do that afterwards. This essay does not try to establish an authoritative list of the necessary and sufficient conditions for universities being Catholic. This admirable task is not mine. Rather, this essay approaches the distinctiveness of a Catholic university from another direction. Taking a cue from John Henry Newman's idea of a university and St. Pope John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution, Ex Cordia Ecclesiae, I want to meditate on what it means for a Catholic university to be a community of scholars. My proposal is based on the works of Edith Stein. I draw on her analysis of 3 interrelated issues. 1, community, 2, the person, and 3, value. Sorry. Value. First, it is significant that a university is a community. A community is a we, and different we's arise in different ways. I will begin with an introduction to Stein's phenomenological analysis of sociality, in order to offer an understanding of a university community as a particular way of being and living together that is distinct from its bureaucratic functionings and machinations. Second, I will explore the question of the distinctive character of a Catholic university via Stein's analogy between communal mind and individual personality. I will conclude with a hypothesis that there are a set of values to which a Catholic community responds, and that there are distinctively Catholic ways to respond to these values. I'm listening to your talk at the beginning, and I'm like, oh my, we'll see how this all goes over. While there are many values to which a Catholic university community responds, I put forward that the 4 principal values are truth, beauty, goodness, and the human person. In this regard, though, I will have more to say about form than content. My comments will focus on 2 of these values, truth and goodness, and I will consider how a Catholic community of scholars relates to the values of truth and goodness in light of the importance of academic freedom, and at the same time the 1967 Land-Blake statement on the idea of a Catholic university and the continuing controversy over what it means for a university to be Catholic. So I begin with Edith Stein's Phenomenology of Social Groups. In 1922, Edith Stein published 2 treatises, Sentient Causality and Individual and Community, in the Yearbook for Philosophy and Phenomenological Research. This edition of the yearbook was intended to be published in 1919 as a celebration of Husserl's 65th birthday, but its publication was delayed for several years because of financial difficulties. The organizing theme of the twin treatises is nothing less than the question of the individual human being's place in the cosmos. On Stein's analysis, the human being stands at the intersection of 2 worlds, the network of material nature and the network of mental or spiritual world. The human being occupies this chiasm but belongs exclusively to neither. The human being is rather the interface between spirit and nature. Sentient causality traces the structure of the human being as a sensate and a mental being. The human body is a physical, psychical system regulated by and subject to natural causal laws. The human spirit is embodied in this sensate system and is a reflectively self-conscious center of experiences. The human being, with its sensate mental nature, stands as the bridge between the physical world of nature and the personal world of objective values. Human experiencing is regulated by life power, in the German Lebenskraft, a term that Stein coins to identify the energy necessary to power the life of consciousness. Life power is the mechanism by which the physical world causally influences consciousness and vice versa. Food, water, and the like provide us with the energy that are necessary to be conscious, but life power also flows in the opposite direction. The spiritual world, the values, provide energy to both the sensate and the mental mechanism of the human person. In a further effort to understand the place of the human person in the cosmos, the task of individual and community is to identify and clarify the individual sources of life power. Stein writes, "We saw the mechanism of sentient occurrences isn't self-contained. The life power that keeps it in operation undergoes influxes from without, and you've got to trace those influxes to their sources." End quote. The goal of individual and community is to understand the universe of sentient reality into which the lone psyche fits as a member. The universe of sentient reality, as Stein calls it, is comprised of lone psyches and the social units that we join together to create. To this end, Stein identifies three basic kinds of social groups: the mass, the association, and the community. The distinction between these three social types is found in the ways that individuals are related to one another in them. To put it slightly differently, in different social relations, individuals share life power in different ways. So, briefly on the three types. The mass is a social group based simply on proximity, and the primary modes of sharing within it are contagion and imitation. For example, an individual may find herself in a crowded bar watching a soccer match, and even though she has no loyalty to either team, she may find herself caught up in the emotions of the crowd. In sentient contagion, the feelings of the person has are anonymous, in the sense that upon closer inspection, she will find that they weren't properly motivated. They were taken up from others for no good reason. Sentient contagion is a weak and a short-lived social bond. It forms on the basis of spatial proximity, and it dissolves whenever the mass dissipates. In contrast, an association is formed on the basis of a shared telos. Examples of what Stein means by associations include corporations, labor unions, colleges and universities, and even book clubs. Members of the association face one another in a subject-object relationship because they have come together to achieve some purpose that typically they cannot achieve on their own. In order to achieve their common goal, the members of the association deal with one another as a means to an end. They manage one another. The association is rational and mechanical. The life of an association, Stein writes, is the functionality directed towards the purpose that's to be attained, or split into a series of functions of various kinds that are distributed to single members or to certain groups of members. And this life is separate from the lives of its members. Compared to the mass, the association is both more enduring and more cohesive. Associations have their origins in acts of institution, such as the founding of a club or a university, and they exist until they're dissolved. Membership in an association may be regulated by formal application procedures. Whether or not one is admitted will depend on one's fitness for the role that the association needs filled. The final social type Stein identifies as the community. By community, she understands a natural and organic union of individuals. As opposed to the subject-object relations of the association, members of community face one another as subject to subject, and solidarity is the prevailing relationship. In community, my relation to you is not determined by what you can do for me or what I need from you in order to accomplish an end. I live openly and naively toward you, and I allow your life and your concerns to determine and influence my own. Community, she writes, comes online when and as long as individuals are naively given over to one another, opened for one another, without having any of the disingenuous orientation toward association in which the one regards the other as an object and shuts himself off from him, end quote. Solidarity with you means that I let your concerns affect me and become my own. Now, there are difficulties in trying to speak of these different kinds of sociality and social life as if they're mutually exclusive, because they're not. An association might be envisioned as a perfectly functioning bureaucratic machine, but Stein declares that she cannot imagine association without any communal bond. I think I could, but I don't like what I see when I do. Death camps come to mind. Furthermore, whenever we live and work together in a communal way, we're able to infect one another on a sentient level. Think of how the good humor of a colleague can spread through a room simply because of her jovial manner. That being said, I will try to treat these forms as if they were distinct. Now, if a university is a kind of community, then it is not, on a Steinian analysis, chiefly oriented around the shared telos of the dissemination of knowledge, the passing on of a tradition, and assuredly not around the granting of degrees. Those are associational functions. They're important, but they don't constitute the communal bond. More important to the constitution of a community is a shared value response. I value what you value because it's valuable to you. I let the values that you respond to affect me because they're important to you, and in doing this, I stand in solidarity with you. So it's natural to ask what value or values are central to the existence of a university community before we think of a Catholic university. The university community is oriented toward the positive value of the scholarly life, or the life of the mind. It affirms the life of the mind as one of the chief values that a person can pursue. It would make no sense to speak of a university that didn't value the life of the mind, or of one that saw it as only secondary value in a person's life. A university unites over its shared belief that the pursuit of the mind is valuable to the person, is valuable to society as a whole, and is the kind of thing that should be preserved, not to mention funded. We can detect a difference between valuing the life of the mind as a community and possessing an associational orientation toward it. A key difference, I maintain, is that the associational orientation toward the scholarly life instrumentalizes it. When placed into such means-ends reasoning, as dominates much of contemporary academia, the pursuit of the mind is subservient to more practical matters like getting a job, earning a living, choosing a major, or adding value to college education, my favorite. On a Steinian analysis, as I clarify below, when I value something, it resonates with a depth of meaning in my personality. And this is quite aside from the question of what it's good for. So, now on to Stein's phenomenology of the emotions and values. I have elsewhere written about Stein's analysis of community in relation to the possibility and structure of communal experience, as well as the relationship between her theories of empathy and community. This essay will pursue another line of thought that is relevant to her writings on human sociality, namely the notion of a character or distinctiveness of a community. Near the end of her essay, Individual and Community, Stein contends that to speak of a communal mind is to say more than the community confronts an object world through sense-filled acts, though it does that too. Beyond that, quote, it signifies the fact that this life exhibits a qualitative unity and is fashioned from a center toward a whole closed in on itself. To speak of a community mind means something analogous to ascribing personal distinctiveness to an individual. The next section presents this analogy between personal and communal distinctiveness. But first we have to start with the person. Stein's phenomenological writings describe the person as a value-tropic being. The value response, she writes, is the most natural behavior for the person. And on the problem of empathy, she describes the person as the subject of the world of spirit, which is the world of objective values. And furthermore, she declares that the person is constituted in and through emotional experiences. Thus, it behooves us to clarify the relationship between the emotions and value. Analysis of affective phenomena was a central motif for the earliest members of the phenomenological movement. These thinkers inherit from Brentano via Husserl a commitment to the intentional reference of affectivity. However, as Ingrid Vendrell-Farren observes, Pace Brentano, for whom values are related to the possible reactions of feeling subjects, Stein and the other early phenomenologists maintain various forms of value realism. Value realism avers that values exist independently of those possible reactions they may elicit in feeling subjects. Now, this value realism manifests itself in differing accounts of the affective sphere for thinkers like Husserl, Scheler, Geiger, Marymount, Stumpf, von Hildebrand, etc., but only Stein's version concerns us here. Her phenomenology of the affective sphere distinguishes between feeling sensations, general moods, feeling sensations, general feelings, moods, emotions, and sentiments. All affective phenomena are oriented toward value, but not all of them disclose or grasp it in the same way. I will restrict my observations to the emotions. 3 factors distinguish emotions as affective phenomena. 1, they are felt in a certain way and show a phenomenal quality. 2, they are intentionally directed toward the world and grasp something objective and external to the stream of experience. And 3, they are constitutive of the self insofar as we grasp the height of the value as corresponding to a level of depth within our personality. Emotions reveal the world of values to us, Stein writes. By this she means that values are given to us in acts of feeling, which are emotional responses. Emotions are not irrational reactions that get in the way of objective thinking. Emotions are mental phenomena that have a distinct intentionality, and there is a logico-normative structure detectable within them. In her interpretation of Stein's account of emotions, Vendrell-Farren applies Anthony Kinney's terminology and notes that, as regards their intentional structure, emotions have both a material and a formal object. So, if I'm joyous over the report that my sister has passed, her PhD comprehensive exams, my joy is intentionally directed at the report as its material object. So she has a cognitive account of the emotions. What Stein calls theoretical acts found our emotional responses and furnish their material objects. The values are the formal objects of emotion. The formal objects of an emotion is the evaluative category that is related to the material object. In the aforementioned example, the joyousness of the report is an objective feature of the report. It's a evaluative category, and my joy grasps this value as its formal object. I should highlight a few features of this account of the emotions before I continue. First, Vendrell-Farren stresses that the formal objects are restricted in a way that material objects are not. In other words, I may be fearful of or joyous over many different things, many different material objects, but the proper formal objects of fear and joy are always the fearful and the joyous. Secondly, the idea of a value-free world is an abstraction on a Steinian account. On her analysis, quote, every fully constituted object is simultaneously a value object. Basically, the value-free world of mere things is an abstraction that's suggested to us by the fact that we aren't equally persuaded by all the intentions that can arise on the basis of the available material, but rather alternate between different orientations. When oriented theoretically, we see mere things. When axiologically oriented, we see values, and in particular aesthetic, ethical, religious values, and so forth. End quote. The fact that the perception of the object and the constitution of the value go hand in hand is important for distinguishing her account of the values from others in the phenomenological tradition. For instance, from Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, who would argue that human beings create value by exercising their freedom, and likewise from Scheler and others who would argue that the feeling of value comes before object constitution. I would add a third intentional reference, though, to this account of Stein's intentionality of the emotions, and that is the self. Emotions contribute to the constitution of the self by revealing a depth stratum of my personality. Comparing acts of feeling with theoretical acts which lack this depth component, Stein writes, The feelings based on this knowledge always reaches into the eye's stability, and it is experienced as issuing out of it. When I feel something is valuable, I also feel myself as the kind of person who takes this to be of value. Thus, emotions have an oblique intentional reference to the individual personality, even if they do not grasp it as either a formal or material object. Above, I also contended that the emotions exhibited a logico-normative structure. An emotional response can be either adequate or not, depending on the motivating power of the value. For instance, I should be more deeply upset about the loss of a family member than I should be about losing my watch. Right? To respond otherwise is to invert the hierarchy of values, to respond and to feel in an irrational and unmotivated way. Thus, Stein argues that the objective values are normative in a logical sense as regards our response to them. She states, the apprehending of a value and the attitude appropriate to it mutually require one another. And while the required attitude is not being experienced, the value isn't being apprehended completely vividly. We also see the normative nature of values in the restriction of an emotion's formal object. It is wrong in the sense of being illogical or inadequately motivated to be joyous over the fearful or to fear the joyous. All right. Now on to individual and communal distinctiveness. What good is all this value talk? Emotions grasp values, and values imbue the life of the individual with a motivating power. Meta Lebec goes so far as to argue that values are motivating power. The act of valuation is not the creation of values. It is rather my permitting the motivating power of the value to flow into my life stream and to direct it, or not. Valuation is the act in which I constitute the values as mine. We should understand this in the context of Stein's theory of life power. Values carry an emotional energy that either fuels or depletes the individual's life stream. They provide propellant powers for our mental life, and thus our life contributing. Speaking of a sentiment, which is a kind of emotion, Stein writes, the love which I meet with strengthens me and invigorates me and grants me the power for unexpected achievements. Any new parent who has had to go to her job on less than 3 hours of sleep just to come home and do it all again the next night knows exactly what she's talking about. When Stein speaks of character, she emphasizes the person's susceptibility for ethical values and acquiescence to them, her permeability for value in general, and thus the stances she takes with her value responses, because emotional responses are just that, a kind of stance taking. She writes, we see what the person is when we see which world of value she lives in, which values she is responsive to, and what achievements she may be creating prompted by the values. End quote. This passage implies that there is both a what and a how, a form and a content to valuation. A person's distinctive character is evidenced by the values she grasps, which world of values she lives in, and how she directs the emotional energy that the values supply. While both form and content reveal the person's character, Stein asserts that, quote, the most authentic sense, end quote, of an individual's character is associated with the form of the value response, the manner in which you let yourself be determined by it in practical behavior. So I'm now in a position to say something about the analogy between individual and communal distinctiveness, and how this analogy might inform us on the question of what makes a university distinctively Catholic. In community, we stand in solidarity with one another. What is solidarity? Stein writes, first of all, it must be said that the solidarity of individuals, which becomes visible in the influence of the attitudes of one upon the life of the others, is formative of community in the highest degree. To put it more precisely, where the individuals are open to one another, where the attitudes of one don't bounce off of the other, but rather penetrate him and deploy their efficacy, there a communal life subsists. There are two members of one whole, and without such a reciprocal relationship, community isn't possible. End quote. Community demands a relationship in which we're open to each other, open to the values that motivate each other. Community demands open and naive commitment, not separated living, but common living, fed from common sources and stirred by common motives. Values provide us with motivational power, and insofar as the individual character is determined by the values to which one responds and the way in which one responds to them, a community's character will show up in the same way. It is constituted through the values that we share and the ways in which these values affect our practical being. So I can't avoid it anymore, even though I'd like to, because I don't like causing trouble. But at this point, the essay demands that I take a stance on which values are essential to a Catholic university and the way or ways in which such a community values them. Now, on the one hand, I take it that it should be impossible to generate an exhaustive list. The Catholic university and the Catholic Church must, in a certain sense, affirm all values, insofar as God is the author and source of all being and hence of all value. In what follows, though, I draw inspiration from Ex Corde Ecclesia to identify the quartet of values that a Catholic university affirms, and I understand these as necessary but not sufficient conditions for university communities being authentically Catholic. Ex Corde Ecclesia begins, born from the heart of the Church, a Catholic university is located in that course of tradition which may be traced back to the very origin of the university as an institution. It has always been recognized as an incomparable center of creativity and dissemination of knowledge for the good of humanity. We may discover these 4 core values here: truth, beauty, goodness, and the human person. As a center for creativity, beauty is central to the Catholic University. To pursue knowledge means a demand for truth. Knowledge is good, and it's good for its own sake, but the dissemination of knowledge is oriented towards the good of humanity and thus the human person. So in the remaining time that I have, I propose to reflect on the way in which a Catholic university community affirms the values of truth and goodness while maintaining academic freedom of its members, and also in light of the Land of Lakes Statement. 51 years ago, the authors of the Land of Lakes Statement, in a certain sense, set the trajectory for the idea of a Catholic university in the 20th and 21st centuries. The authors of this statement declare, quote, "To perform its teaching and research functions effectively, the Catholic university must have a true autonomy and academic freedom in the face of authority of whatever kind, lay or clerical, external to the academic community itself." End quote. Critics of this statement see it as leading to the inevitable secularization of the Catholic university. For instance, Peter Mitchell remarks that, caught up in the unique cultural moment of the late 1960s, the Catholic educators who issued the Land of Lakes Statement blazed a trail in which Catholic institutions of higher education became indistinct from their secular counterparts and effectively denying the existence of dogmatic truth. How are we to respond? Does the insistence on academic freedom from authorities external to the academic community amount to a denial of the existence of dogmatic truth? Is it a signal of a divorce between the Catholic university and the teaching authority of the magisterium? These are questions I cannot answer fully in this essay. They require an extended attempt to answer the question of the nature of the relationship between what are on the one hand autonomous degree-granting institutions, and on the other hand, the teaching authority of the bishops of the Church. So how should we interpret this statement in light of the preceding Steinian approach to understanding the community as a group of individuals who stand in solidarity with one another and affirm the same values in the same ways? Is the insistence on academic freedom in the face of all authority external to the academic community inimical to a university's identifying itself as Catholic? I just don't think so. In an interpretive essay responding to Newman's idea of a university, George Marsden writes, "For an academic community to function effectively, it must allow some room for relatively dispassionate analysis in which all parties are open to some correction of their views. Preempting all discussion by appealing to religious authority or to evidence not accessible to others, or by one-sided preaching or proselytizing, undercuts the possibility of worthwhile exchanges in diverse academic settings. The dual focus is important here. There must be room for relatively dispassionate analysis that isn't antecedently restricted by appeals to religious authority. But all parties must be open to some correction of their views. How then should we understand this declaration of academic freedom when we are rightly concerned to promote the value of truth and are genuinely concerned with the moral formation of our students? Universities should not prevent their faculties from pursuing any field of knowledge. Faculty must have the freedom to follow the truth wherever it leads. We must insist on the value of truth. As Catholic universities, we must be confident of the unity of all truth in God, who is the author of all being and the source of all truth. Restricting the curriculum, banning books or subjects, and interfering with academic freedom strangles the Spirit of Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the light. But academic freedom does not and cannot mean the freedom to teach falsity and encourage immorality unchecked. Academic freedom is not the freedom to be wrong if I so choose. We have to resist understanding academic freedom as a right to not be disagreed with. It is the freedom to speak truth to power and the freedom to defend truth when challenged. It's easy to hide behind academic freedom when a colleague challenges us, and that's what's necessary. The survival of a truly Catholic university in the 21st century demands faculty members who have both the freedom and the courage to challenge each other as members of the same community. If we are to declare ourselves independent from all lay and clerical authorities that are external to the academic community, we have to submit ourselves to the authority of the truth within the very communities we want to defend. We must cultivate the courage to challenge our students to seek the truth, the courage to challenge our colleagues when they put forth ideas that are either false or immoral, and we must cultivate the courage to respond to challenges from our colleagues. This means we have to engage each other's work. There isn't any way around it. No silos. Academic freedom in the light of the insistence on truth demands that we defend reasonably, civilly, and in the spirit of love what we believe, teach, and publish. Ironically, the spirit of academic freedom demands that we invoke it only as a last resort when we are in fact censored. I'm closing now, but I keep coming back to how much courage this vision demands. If we want authentically Catholic universities, we have to have the courage to allow the pursuit of truth in all of its forms and the courage to challenge each other when we think that one of us has gone beyond the boundaries of truth. But in the university, we're operating at the very boundaries of human knowledge, where the line between truth and falsity isn't always easily discernible. It takes courage to operate on this frontier and to be committed to truth when it isn't evident. Just like it takes courage to allow your child to attend one of these universities when you're afraid of what might become of them. This is, I think, a radical reconsideration of what a university looks like. Catholic universities should not model themselves after even the most successful public universities. Catholic higher education should be distinctively different from secular university education, and the choice to attend a Catholic university should be a radical one that provides a rigorous university education while also signifying the choice to live and move and have our being in the spirit of Christ and His church. Thank you.
Thank you to both speakers. Before we open it up for discussion, I want to offer them an opportunity to respond to each other a little bit. And if either of you would like to speak to the other's paper, ask a question.
So thank you very much, Tim. I like this whole thing of the difference between an association and a community. I've never thought about that. So I presume that's Gesellschaft versus Gemeinschaft. And I mean, yeah, we do kind of treat, I was thinking corporations, but also you could say associations. That's kind of, you have admissions, you get, then you get degrees or some sort of perk.
Yeah.
So that was very helpful. Is there anything you could say more about, so you talked about truth, a little bit about goodness. Why did you leave out beauty?
It was already 20 pages long. They're all important, and I guess in response to that, I'll comment on a little bit on your essay as well. I sort of saw something of this distinction that Stein makes in Newman's distinction between education and instruction, where instruction is mechanical and education is philosophical. I wasn't going to leave out beauty because I just like it. I think beauty is wonderful. On the one hand, aesthetics is like that one branch of philosophy I really wish I knew more about and then I could speak more on. But I was struck by the emphasis you had on interdisciplinarity. And I've always been kind of tentative about this because I've worried that a focus on interdisciplinarity will come at the cost of disciplinarity, right? It's one thing to ask scholars who have years of experience in their fields to engage in interdisciplinary debates, which is in one sense like maybe asking the wolf to guard the hen house or something. Or you might be asking them to do something they're not qualified for, but at least they have an idea of it. But I worry that I like the idea of a double major in this sense as a way to approach interdisciplinarity, because I feel like if you just try to put interdisciplinarity into, say, the philosophy classroom or the theology classroom, the disciplinary training that's necessary for interdisciplinarity gets clouded, and like you get something that is not distinctively either discipline, but it's kind of a sloppy way of doing two things. So I like the double major approach though, because it puts them with experts in both fields.
Yeah, and I think Newman's idea was that by attentiveness to other disciplines, other subjects, other fields, that the scholar benefits in a more concrete, a better appreciation of their own discipline, and not just in terms of its application or its relationship with other disciplines, but also sort of highlights things that the scholar hasn't thought about in their own discipline. So, as Catherine introduced, I didn't realize we were going to talk about the Catholics in Hollywood thing. I've kind of hidden that. I mean, so when I was here, that was, I decided to do this, and I thought it was crazy at the time. But it was great because I looked at theology very differently. I looked at church history a lot differently. Because I had learned the language of the industry. It was just fun to learn something I didn't know anything about. I think, but that's what a university is about, right? You have colleagues you can learn from.
We have to. It's easy, especially when, take Los Angeles for an example. It's difficult to live near where you work, right? And it's difficult to have the time to engage with each other when you've got an hour and a half or 2 hours to get home. When Stein talks about communal living, she wrote these treatises before she converted to Catholicism, even though they were published in the year that she converted. They were finished by 1918. I think she means like literally living together under a single roof, like living together and sharing meals. And that kind of thing is hard to get at a university when you're trying to, commute from so far and also like spend some time with your family and go to all of these required, meetings and all of your mentoring and teaching, and all of those things are important and valuable, and but then make some time to go talk to somebody in the communications department about their research, it's difficult. And this, one thing I thought about when you were talking was that Newman's pretty clear that the purpose of a university is the dissemination, not the production of knowledge, right? He thinks that, like, the Royal Academy for the Sciences and things like that, these are places for the production of knowledge. The purpose of a university is the dissemination of knowledge and the passing on of the knowledge of the tradition. And in that sense, right, a university, at least under a Newmanian idea, really is more teaching and mentoring focused than research focused. And it's easy to lose that in the corporatization of a university, especially when, if there's any external funding at all, it comes in not for teaching but for research.
Yeah, and it's at the same time, we can't undervalue research, right, in terms of the quality of faculty in a university. But Newman does make this helpful distinction between a university and an academy. An academy, that's where the research happens. That's what's supposed to facilitate research. In the university, the focus is on teaching. And I think it's even though it's hard to sort of force that into the model of the 21st century university as we have it, I think it's very helpful for Catholics to keep that in mind, at least, that sort of distinction. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
One way to think of the distinction between the university and the academy, as Newman presented it, is, at least in this country, we have the distinction between undergraduate studies and graduate studies. Graduate studies is where most of the research gets done. It's just that they happen to be under one roof or in one campus, not totally different institutions. Now that distinction gets blurred, I think, maybe too much at the undergraduate level, but it's kind of what has, I think, happened historically in this country.
One quick thought about that is, at the same time, for a lot of, especially for a lot of smaller Catholic universities, graduate programs have just become money-making endeavors, right? Get your online MBA from XYZ, and they are associationally directed in the sort of fullest sense. Not even necessarily towards research, but really it seems like, it's they help balance the books.
I went to a smaller university. I mean, it's called a sub-university because it had a doctorate, and I think it was education. And I lament I wasn't at my first choice. I was just bad at tests. That's what I like to say, at least. But I had a mentor, and he told me one time, I can't forget it, that Paul, if you were there at another institution, you would not have got the attention you did here, because the attention would be on the graduate students, not the undergraduates. And that is so true. And that is, in a way, I should say, one of the strengths of a place like LMU is, yes, there are graduate programs, but at least what I experienced, that the focus that is really on the undergraduate. And that gets closer to Newman's ultimate vision.
Yeah, I want to push a little bit of this interdisciplinarity question that Paul has raised for us, because I think there is a good question of if we're going to, embrace Paul's idea of the university and make undergraduates be interdisciplinary, make students be interdisciplinary, why shouldn't we at the same time make faculty do that in a responsible fashion? Right? I'm not saying you should, it's maybe quite as radical in interdisciplinarity of as the students would be encountering. In other words, having the same faculty teaching professional courses, liberal arts courses, and whatnot. But shouldn't that shouldn't that interdisciplinarity be an aspect to the kind of integration of knowledge that one ought to see there? I know there are challenges to this, right? Because faculty like the idea, partially because they want to do research of getting 2 or 3 preps and repeating them. But if we're really going to push this question, wouldn't we want faculty to also be interdisciplinary and to be comfortable engaging with things that are at a reasonable distance from their core interests?
Absolutely. Like I said, that's the whole idea behind ACTI here at LMU. And I only wanted to take on so much,
Sure.
I only want to be so controversial.
Phase 2.
Right, phase 2, put it in print instead of talk. Yeah. But I think a very important part of that is not only faculty sharing their research, but again, this sort of sense of community and then sort of the residential nature of the university. Because, for instance, why are we here? Wouldn't it make more sense to just have distribute papers, we read papers, we respond or something? Why fly all the way to LA? Well, because it's LA and I live in Milwaukee, and it's March. But it's really sort of the interaction with colleagues and talking about various ideas and really sort of allowing yourself to be challenged instead of just talking to yourself or listening to NPR. But in terms of students and the whole idea of sort of a forced double major, I would like to think, and I experience it at certain institutions, even here, that when faculty find out students are interested in something like this, oh, you're doing theology and film? Really? That's interesting. That it has the potential to sort of inspire faculty interdisciplinarity. Not unsure, of course. You need faculty. Like I said, we need incentives too. So I'm absolutely completely agree with that.
So if I can be so bold as to propose to dovetail off of what Daniel said and what you've suggested, Paul, as well as Tim, some institutions I've seen as a model of doing this, a fourth suggestion, is to have faculty from different disciplines team teach classes. And if you look developmentally at where our students are at 17, 18, 19, 20, even if you're requiring them to double major, they're not necessarily developmentally in a place. They're hearing things in their theology class, and then they're going to their economics class, and they're going, well, some of this doesn't make sense. They seem to be, and they're trying to wrestle with that, but they aren't developmentally in a space where they can really do that. And I think, too, that would respond to Tim's concern over developing this community and where can we foster that and have a real space for that to happen. If part of this double major, part of that, and again, that requires that we change the incentives that we have for faculty, that we're changing in terms of how we reward them, in terms of their loads, and who gets credit for this sort of stuff. But to have faculty really have to sit together and talk about this, and how do you see aesthetics in theology or philosophy, and how does that interact with the reality of the economic situation we're in? So I'd be interested to hear that as kind of another option to pursuing this.
So I'm teaching my first team talk course right now. It's at a seminary, so it's by interdisciplinarity. At the seminary, we're talking about church history and scripture. So
big stuff.
baby steps. But I was dreading this conversation about not just. I was looking for. I love my colleague, but we're going to have to sit down and craft a syllabus together. And I'm pretty territorial about my syllabi. So I made sure we did this at a pub and sort of eased into it. But it's been very rewarding because, students, when they're asking the question, well, how does this go with this part of the class? Those are the classes you remember as an undergrad. But yes, there's the whole thing, well then, how does it affect teaching and everything? But again, it's a matter of what's our priority? Is it the student? If it's the student, well then that sort of directs how we think about things like course loads and incentives for faculty.
Yeah, one of the things when Paul told me yesterday that he was going to suggest double majors for all students, I started trying to think about how is that going to affect the number of professors you have to hire, right? Like if every student has to take a major in the liberal arts college, either class sizes are going to grow or the professorial ranks are going to grow. Right? And so we have to make a decision about where we're going to invest the funds that are available to us. Even if it's not so radical a suggestion as that, but I was going to make some comment about the way we exploit adjuncts, but I won't. Yeah, we have to decide what ways of spending our money are in line with our mission too.
Other questions? Does either of you want to make a final comment?
It was a pleasure, Paul.
It was indeed a pleasure. So let's thank our speakers one last time.